They thought humiliating a waitress would make them look powerful. But before the night ended, an entire restaurant would learn what silence feels like when the wrong man walks into the room. The music inside Belladonna Steakhouse pulsed softly beneath crystal chandeliers and golden light. The kind of place where wealthy people ordered $300 bottles of wine just to let strangers know they could. Every table glittered with polished silverware and designer watches, but near the center booth, laughter had turned sharp enough to cut through the entire dining room. Amara Brooks balanced a tray of cocktails against one hand while trying to ignore the phones pointed at her from every direction. "Come on, smile for the camera." One of the women laughed, her manicured fingers waving a stack of cash through the air like Amara was part of the entertainment. The group at table 12 had arrived 40 minutes earlier with bodyguards, expensive perfume, and the kind of arrogance money couldn't hide. Social media influencers, millions of followers. The manager had practically bowed when they walked through the doors. "Whatever they want, give it to them," he'd whispered to the staff. "No complaints tonight." Amara had heard that tone before. It always meant dignity came second to profit. She placed the drinks down carefully, her dark curls pulled into a neat bun. Her white uniform pressed perfectly despite working a double shift that had already stretched past 10 hours. Her feet ached inside cheap black shoes, but rent was due Friday morning, and her younger brother's college payment was already 3 weeks late. Exhaustion didn't matter. Pride didn't matter. Survival did. "Wait," the blonde woman at the table suddenly said. "You forgot my extra sauce." Amara glanced down. The small silver cup sat right beside the woman's plate, untouched. The others noticed too, but instead of saying anything, they smirked at each other like children planning a prank. "Oh my God." One man laughed loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "Maybe she can't see it." Another lifted his phone higher. "Nah, she sees it. She's just slow." A few uncomfortable chuckles spread through the restaurant. Amara felt heat crawl into her cheeks, but her voice stayed calm. "I apologize, Mom. Is there anything else I can get for you?" The blonde woman leaned back in her chair, eyes glittering with cruelty disguised as amusement. "Actually, yeah." Before Amara could react, a handful of French fries scattered across the front of her uniform, dropping onto the polished hardwood floor. The table exploded with laughter. Someone clapped. Another phone tilted closer to capture her face. "Now it matches your apron." The woman giggled. For half a second, nobody moved. Not the bartender polishing glasses behind the counter. Not the couples pretending not to stare. Not even the manager standing near the kitchen entrance, watching the scene unfold with nervous sweat gathering beneath his collar. Amara looked down at the fries scattered near her shoes. Her hands trembled once against the tray before she steadied them again. She had learned years ago that humiliation became worse the moment people saw it break you. "Clean it up," the manager hissed under his breath as he rushed over. "Just do it quietly." Amara slowly bent toward the floor while cameras continued recording. But then something else echoed through the restaurant. A glass touching marble, soft, controlled, heavy enough to silence every laugh in the room. The sound was small, almost delicate, but somehow it carried farther than the laughter had. Every head in Belladonna Steakhouse slowly turned toward the dark corner booth near the back wall. The man sitting there had not raised his voice. He had not moved quickly. He had simply lowered his crystal glass onto the marble table with controlled precision, and suddenly the entire room felt colder. Amara stayed frozen halfway to the floor, fries scattered around her black shoes. Her tray trembling slightly in her hands. Even the influencers at table 12 stopped smiling. The blonde woman lowered her phone first. Something in the atmosphere had shifted too fast for anyone to explain. The manager swallowed hard. "Oh no," he whispered under his breath. At the corner booth, the stranger finally stood. His charcoal suit fit him perfectly, tailored so sharply it seemed carved onto his frame. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair brushed neatly back and a calm expression that somehow felt more dangerous than anger. Silver glinted from the watch on his wrist as he adjusted his cufflinks with slow, measured movements. Two men near the entrance straightened instantly the moment he rose, their posture changing from casual to alert. Bodyguards, real ones, not social media security hired for appearances. The blonde influencer forced out an awkward laugh. Does somebody know him? Nobody answered her. Because suddenly, everyone did. A bartender near the wine station went pale. One of the kitchen staff actually stepped backward, and the manager looked like he had forgotten how to breathe. Vincent Moretti rarely appeared in public, but when he did, people remembered it for years. Most customers only knew him as a silent investor tied to restaurants, hotels, and luxury properties across Chicago. They did not know about the old money, the political favors, or the whispered stories attached to his name. But the employees knew. Every person working at Belladonna knew exactly who owned the building beneath their feet. Vincent stepped forward without rushing. His polished shoes crossed the hardwood floor in steady silence, while the music overhead suddenly felt too loud, too fake, too cheerful for the tension tightening inside the room. Amara slowly stood upright again, still holding the tray against her chest like a shield. Frosting stained the sleeve of her white uniform. A fry clung near the edge of her apron. Vincent noticed everything: the phones recording, the food on the floor, the tears Amara was trying not to let fall, and most of all, the way the manager avoided looking directly at him. Mr. Moretti. The manager finally stammered, forcing a smile that collapsed almost immediately. We did not know you were coming tonight. Vincent did not answer him. His eyes stayed on Amara for one quiet second longer than expected. She lowered her gaze automatically. Years of working service jobs had taught her one rule above all others. Powerful men were safer when ignored. But Vincent did not move past her. Instead, he bent slightly, picked up a white linen napkin from an empty table nearby, and held it out toward her without a word. Amara hesitated before taking it carefully. Her fingers shook against the cloth. The blonde influencer laughed nervously again, trying to reclaim control of the moment. Seriously, it was just a joke, she said. Everybody is way too sensitive now. Vincent finally looked at her. The room seemed to stop breathing. A joke, he repeated softly, his deep voice calm enough to make the silence even heavier. The woman shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Yes, we were only having fun. Vincent glanced once toward the phone still live streaming on the table. Tens of thousands of viewers were watching in real time. Then his gaze returned to the fries scattered across the floor beside Amara's feet. Interesting, he said quietly. Because where I come from, people who humiliate workers in public usually do not call it fun. The blonde woman opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out fast enough to fill the pressure settling across the restaurant. Vincent Moretti stood perfectly still beside the table, one hand resting loosely near his pocket, his expression unreadable beneath the warm chandelier light. Somehow that calmness unsettled people more than shouting ever could. Around the dining room, forks stopped moving. Conversations disappeared completely. Even the pianist near the bar had gone silent without realizing it. Amara remained beside the table, holding the linen napkin against her stained sleeve, trying to make herself smaller while every eye in the building stayed fixed on her. The live stream phone still pointed toward the scene, its screen glowing bright against the dark tablecloth. Comments flooded the stream faster than the influencer could read them. Some viewers laughed, others demanded the camera stay rolling. Nobody understood yet that the mood inside Belladonna had shifted from entertainment to judgment. The blonde woman finally forced a brittle smile. Look, Mr. Moretti. Right. Nobody was trying to hurt anybody. She is a waitress. We were teasing her a little. People online love this kind of stuff. Vincent glanced toward the phone again. Do they? He asked quietly. His tone stayed polite. But something underneath it made the manager wipe sweat from his forehead for the third time in less than a minute. One of the men at the table leaned back in his chair, trying to sound confident again. "Come on, man. It is not that serious." We tipped her. He pointed toward the cash still scattered near the spilled fries on the floor. Vincent followed the gesture slowly. The room waited. "Interesting," he said after a pause. "You throw food at her. Humiliate her in front of strangers. Record it for millions of people. Then you place money on the table and call it respect." Nobody answered, because suddenly the logic sounded ugly out loud. Amara lowered her eyes again, wishing she could disappear entirely. Her chest felt tight beneath the embarrassment still burning through her body. She had spent years learning how to survive moments like this. Stay calm. Do not react. Finish the shift. Go home. Cry later. But something about Vincent standing there made the humiliation feel exposed in a different way, as if somebody had finally forced the entire room to look directly at what they had allowed to happen. The manager stepped forward carefully. "Sir, I can handle this," he rushed to say. "The guests were only having fun, and Amara understands how important our high-profile clients are." Vincent turned his head slowly toward him. The manager immediately stopped speaking. "Her name is Amara." Vincent asked. "Yes, sir." The manager answered quietly. Vincent nodded once before looking back at her. "How long have you worked here?" Amara hesitated. Her voice nearly disappeared when she answered, "Almost 2 years, sir." "And in those 2 years," Vincent asked calmly, "has anyone here ever taught these customers how to treat you like a human being?" The question landed harder than anger could have. The manager looked horrified. The influencers shifted awkwardly in their seats. Somewhere near the back of the restaurant, a glass accidentally slipped against a plate with a tiny sharp clink that echoed through the silence. Amara swallowed carefully. "I just try to do my job, sir." Vincent studied her for a long second. Frosting still stained part of her sleeve. Her mascara had smudged slightly beneath tired eyes that looked older than 27. He noticed the exhaustion in the way she stood, the quiet discipline in the way she kept apologizing without saying the word sorry. Then his gaze moved toward the live stream again. "End the video," he said softly. The blonde woman blinked. "Excuse me." Vincent did not raise his voice. "You made her humiliation public," he replied. "Now let us see if you know how to end it with the same energy." The blonde influencer stared at Vincent Moretti as if waiting for someone else in the room to laugh first, to prove this was still part of the joke. Nobody did. Around her, the restaurant had fallen into the kind of silence that made every tiny sound feel enormous. Ice shifted softly inside untouched water glasses. A chair creaked near the back wall. Somewhere in the kitchen, a cook accidentally dropped a spoon, then immediately froze when the noise echoed too loudly into the dining room. The woman slowly reached toward the phone, streaming live to hundreds of thousands of followers. Her hand shook slightly now. "You are seriously overreacting," she muttered, but her confidence no longer matched her voice. Vincent waited without blinking. Finally, she ended the live stream. The screen went black. It should have ended there. It should have been enough. But humiliation has a strange way of revealing people once power changes sides. One of the men at the table scoffed under his breath and leaned back deeper into his chair. "This is insane," he said loudly. "She is literally a waitress. Why are we acting like she is royalty?" Amara felt the words hit harder than the fries had, because it was never really about the food. It was about reminding someone where they stood in the room. Her fingers tightened around the linen napkin Vincent had handed her earlier. She hated that her eyes burned again. Hated that strangers had seen her cry. Vincent looked toward the man slowly. "And what exactly?" he asked in that same calm voice. "Does being a waitress make her unworthy of respect?" The man rolled his eyes, still too arrogant to recognize danger when it stood directly in front of him. "Come on, you know what I mean?" Vincent took one quiet step closer to the table. Not aggressive, not rushed, somehow worse because of how controlled it was. No, he replied softly. I do not. The man opened his mouth again, but this time his friends did not support him. They avoided eye contact completely. Even the blonde woman looked uncomfortable now, realizing the situation had slipped beyond social media drama into something real. Vincent glanced once toward the manager. How much did this table spend tonight? The manager blinked rapidly. Approximately $4,000, sir. Vincent nodded thoughtfully. 4,000. His eyes moved back toward the food scattered across the floor. Interesting how quickly people mistake spending money for owning dignity. Nobody spoke. Vincent turned toward Amara again, and for the first time all night, his expression softened slightly. Did you do anything to deserve this? Amara immediately shook her head. No, sir. Did you insult them? No, sir. Did you disrespect them? No. Her voice came out quieter this time. Vincent studied her face carefully, as if measuring the exhaustion hidden behind her composure. He noticed the way she stood, despite humiliation still clinging to her shoulders. Most people in that room would have walked out already. But she stayed because people with overdue rent do not always have the luxury of pride. Vincent understood that better than anyone realized. 30 years earlier, his mother had cleaned hotel rooms 12 hours a day while wealthy guests ignored her existence completely. He still remembered watching her polish marble floors while businessmen stepped around her like furniture. Respect had mattered deeply to her because almost nobody offered it freely. That memory settled behind his eyes now as he looked at Amara standing alone beneath the chandelier light. Get her another uniform, Vincent said quietly to the manager. Immediately. Yes, sir. And after that? Vincent continued. She is done working for the night. Amara looked up in surprise. Panic flickered briefly across her face. Sir, I cannot leave early. I need the hours. Vincent noticed the fear instantly. Not fear of him, fear of losing income, fear of consequences. The kind of fear exhausted people carried every day without speaking about it. The manager rushed to interrupt. Of course, she will still be paid for the full shift. Vincent turned his gaze toward him slowly. The full week, he corrected. The manager swallowed hard. Yes, sir. Vincent looked back at Amara one more time. Nobody should have to earn a paycheck by swallowing humiliation, and somehow, in the silence that followed, those words made several people lower their eyes in shame. For several long seconds, nobody inside Belladonna Steakhouse moved at all. The influencers stared down at the table like children suddenly realizing their actions had consequences beyond the internet. The manager stood stiff beside the kitchen entrance, terrified of saying the wrong thing again, and Amara remained frozen beneath the chandelier light, still trying to process the fact that someone powerful had finally looked at her humiliation and called it wrong instead of inconvenient. Vincent Moretti slowly reached for the chair across from the influencer table and turned it slightly toward Amara. Sit down, he said calmly. Her eyes widened immediately. Sir, you have been standing for 10 hours, Vincent replied. Sit. The room watched her carefully lower herself into the chair, uncertain whether she was allowed to breathe normally yet. Her apron was stained. Frosting still clung near the cuff of her sleeve despite the napkin. She looked embarrassed to even occupy the seat. Across the dining room, customers who had ignored her all night suddenly could not stop staring. Respect changes shape quickly when fear enters the room beside it. Vincent looked toward the bartender. Bring her water. Right away, sir. The bartender nearly rushed over with the glass before the sentence fully ended. Amara accepted it carefully with trembling fingers. Thank you. Vincent gave a slight nod before turning his attention back toward the table of influencers. You said people online enjoy humiliation, he said softly. The blonde woman shifted uncomfortably. I mean, people watch dramatic stuff. Interesting. Vincent folded one hand over the other. And if someone treated your mother this way for entertainment, would you still call it content? The question landed like cold rain across the table. One of the women looked away instantly. Another lowered her eyes toward the untouched dessert plate in front of her. But the blonde influencer forced out another weak laugh. "You are making this way deeper than it is." Vincent studied her quietly. "No," he replied after a pause. "I think your generation simply became too comfortable confusing cruelty with confidence." Nobody interrupted him. Nobody dared. Near the front entrance, two older customers exchanged uncomfortable glances before quietly leaving cash beneath their wine glasses and slipping out of the restaurant. The atmosphere inside Belladonna no longer felt glamorous. It felt exposed, like every person there had suddenly become aware of what kind of human being they appeared to be when nobody important was watching. Vincent turned toward the manager again. "Tell me something honestly." "Yes, sir. If I had not walked in tonight, what would have happened?" The manager opened his mouth, then hesitated too long. That hesitation answered everything. Vincent leaned back slightly in his chair. "You would have made her clean the floor." The manager lowered his head. "Probably, sir." And tomorrow, Vincent continued calmly. The video would spread online. Millions of strangers laughing at one exhausted woman trying to earn rent money. Nobody at the table could look directly at Amara anymore, because suddenly her existence had become real to them beyond the uniform. Vincent noticed her hands tightening around the water glass. "Who depends on you?" he asked gently. Amara blinked in surprise at the question. "My younger brother," she answered quietly. "He is in college, and this job helps pay for it." She nodded once. Vincent leaned back slowly, his expression unreadable again. "My mother cleaned hotel rooms for most of her life," he said after a moment. The confession surprised everyone. People with money rarely looked at her face, but she taught me something very important when I was a boy. The restaurant stayed completely silent. Vincent glanced once around the room before finishing quietly. "A person who serves you food is still a person." The words settled heavily into the air between crystal glasses and expensive watches. Even the influencers finally looked ashamed now. But Vincent was not finished. His gaze returned to the manager one final time. "And tomorrow morning," he said softly, "every employee in this restaurant will receive a raise." The manager blinked in shock. Several staff members near the kitchen exchanged stunned looks. Vincent's voice never changed. "Because if customers can afford $4,000 dinners," he continued, "then the people carrying the plates deserve to go home with dignity too." The silence inside Belladonna Steakhouse no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt revealing, like every person sitting beneath the warm chandelier light had suddenly been forced to examine themselves in a mirror they never asked to face. Staff members near the kitchen stood frozen in disbelief after hearing Vincent Moretti announce raises for every employee. One server quietly pressed her hand against her mouth. A dishwasher near the swinging kitchen doors looked seconds away from tears. Nobody in that building had ever heard ownership speak about workers like they mattered, especially not publicly. The manager cleared his throat nervously. "Sir, are you certain that is a major expense?" Vincent looked at him calmly. "No," he replied. "Losing your humanity is a major expense. Paying workers fairly is called responsibility." The manager lowered his eyes immediately. Amara sat quietly beside the table, still holding the glass of water between both hands. The ice had nearly melted completely. She kept waiting for the moment this would end, for reality to snap back into place and remind her people like Vincent Moretti did not normally defend women like her. But every time she glanced up, he was still there, calm, controlled, watching the room with sharp attention while everyone else avoided eye contact. One of the younger influencers finally spoke, her voice much softer now. "We really did not mean for it to go that far." Vincent turned toward her. "That is usually how cruelty begins," he answered quietly. "People convince themselves they are only joking because accountability feels inconvenient." The young woman looked ashamed enough to shrink into her chair. Beside her, The blonde influencer still seemed unwilling to fully surrender her pride. "This is ridiculous," she muttered. "People online roast each other every day." Vincent nodded once. "Yes," he said. "And somehow loneliness, anxiety, and depression continue rising every year. Funny how those things connect." Nobody laughed. The weight of his words settled heavily across the room again. Amara noticed something strange then. The customers who had once stared at her with pity or discomfort were now staring at Vincent differently, not with fear exactly, with recognition, like they were realizing power did not always have to humiliate people to prove itself. Near the back of the restaurant, an elderly couple quietly applauded once, softly, respectfully. Then another table joined them. A moment later, more hands followed. Not loud cheering, not celebration, something quieter than that. Acknowledgement. Amara's eyes widened in shock as the sound spread gently through Belladonna. Nobody looked at her like entertainment anymore. For the first time all night, they looked at her like a human being. Her throat tightened instantly. Vincent did not smile at the applause. He simply looked toward the staff members surrounding the room. "Take care of each other in this place," he said calmly, "because customers remember luxury for one night. Employees remember humiliation for years." The words struck deep enough that even the manager seemed unable to argue anymore. One of Vincent's bodyguards stepped quietly toward him and leaned close enough to speak in a low voice. Vincent listened without changing expression. Then he nodded once. "Understood." Amara noticed the bodyguard glance briefly toward the influencer table before stepping away again. The blonde woman looked suddenly nervous. "What was that about?" she asked quickly. Vincent folded his hands together. "My assistant informed me your sponsorship dinner tonight was connected to Belladonna's upcoming charity gala." Her face brightened slightly, thinking the worst had passed. "Exactly. We were helping promote the event." Vincent tilted his head slightly. "No." He corrected softly. "You were representing it." The confidence drained from her expression immediately. Vincent's gaze stayed perfectly steady. "And after tonight, I no longer believe your values represent this restaurant." The entire table froze. Even the manager looked stunned. The blonde woman blinked rapidly. "Wait, what does that mean?" Vincent reached for the untouched dessert menu near the edge of the table and closed it gently. "It means," he said quietly, "your invitations to the gala have been revoked." The words landed with surgical precision. No yelling, no threats, just consequences, real ones. Around the restaurant, nobody spoke at all, because suddenly every person there understood the same thing at once. The most powerful punishment in the room had not come from anger. It came from dignity, refusing to tolerate disrespect any longer. The words hung over the restaurant like the final note of a song nobody knew how to follow. "Your invitations to the gala have been revoked." The blonde influencer stared at Vincent Moretti as if she genuinely believed money alone should protect her from consequences. "You cannot do that," she said finally, though the confidence in her voice had cracked completely. Vincent met her gaze without emotion. "I already did." Around the dining room, people remained perfectly silent. But the atmosphere had changed again. Earlier, the room had felt tense. Now it felt awake. Customers who had spent the first half of the evening pretending not to notice humiliation were suddenly paying attention to every word, because deep down, everyone recognized the truth unfolding in front of them. Respect had finally entered the room, wearing a tailored black suit instead of a uniform stained with frosting. The blonde woman leaned forward desperately. "Do you have any idea how much exposure we bring to this place?" Vincent nodded once. Enough exposure to publicly humiliate a woman working a double shift. Her expression tightened. "That is not fair." "No," Vincent replied softly. What happened to her was not fair. The simplicity of the answer silenced her again. Amara sat quietly nearby, still trying to understand how the entire night had transformed so quickly. less than 30 minutes earlier. She had been kneeling on the floor while strangers laughed into their phones. Now the same people could barely hold eye contact with her. It felt unreal, dangerous almost, like waking up inside someone else's life. One of the younger waiters approached carefully carrying a folded replacement uniform. "Here you go, Amara," he whispered gently. His voice held something new. Respect, not pity, not embarrassment. Respect. Amara accepted the clean uniform with trembling hands. "Thank you." Vincent noticed the exchange quietly. Then his eyes shifted toward the manager one final time. "There is one more thing we need to address." The manager straightened instantly. "Yes." Sir Vincent folded the white linen napkin neatly on the table beside him. "When your employee was humiliated tonight, you told her to clean it up and smile." The manager's face drained of color immediately. Several staff members lowered their eyes. They had heard it too. "Sir? I was only trying to avoid conflict with customers." Vincent tilted his head slightly. "And in the process, you became part of the humiliation." The manager opened his mouth, searching desperately for an excuse that did not exist. "I did not mean any harm." Vincent's expression never changed. Most people who fail others rarely do. The words landed harder than shouting could have, because they sounded true. The manager swallowed visibly. "Sir, please, I have worked here 11 years. Vincent nodded once. And how many employees learned to stay silent because they were afraid management would not protect them? The manager had no answer. Neither did anyone else. Vincent stood slowly from his chair, and the movement alone caused the room to straighten instinctively. Power moved differently when it did not need to announce itself. He adjusted the cuff of his charcoal suit before speaking again. "Effective immediately. You are suspended pending review." The manager looked stunned. "Sir, people in leadership positions set the moral temperature of a room." Vincent continued calmly. "Tonight you taught your staff that profit mattered more than dignity." The manager lowered his head completely now. No argument left. No pride left either. Near the kitchen entrance, several employees exchanged shocked glances, not because the punishment felt cruel, because accountability felt unfamiliar. Vincent turned away from the manager, then looked toward Amara once more. "Nobody should have to choose between paying bills and keeping self-respect," he said quietly. Something inside Amara finally cracked at those words. Not dramatically. Just a small trembling breath she could not hold back anymore. She looked down quickly, embarrassed by the tears gathering again, but Vincent did not pretend not to notice. He simply stepped closer and placed a business card gently on the table beside her untouched glass of water. Gold lettering shimmered beneath the chandelier light. Amara stared at it in confusion. "What is this?" she asked softly. Vincent's voice remained calm. A different opportunity. The room fell silent all over again. Amara stared at the gold-embossed business card lying beside her water glass as if it belonged to someone else entirely. The black lettering reflected softly beneath the chandelier light. Vincent Moretti, Executive Director, Moretti Hospitality Group. Her fingers hovered above the card without touching it. Around the restaurant, nobody spoke. Even the influencers sat frozen now, forgotten by the room they had once controlled so easily. "I do not understand," Amara admitted quietly. Vincent remained standing beside the table, calm as ever. "You said your brother is in college," he replied. "Yes, sir. And you work double shifts to help support him." She nodded carefully. Vincent glanced once around Belladonna Steakhouse before returning his attention to her. People who work this hard without losing their kindness are rare. The words hit Amara harder than the humiliation earlier had, because nobody had called her kind in a very long time. Responsible, reliable, quiet. Invisible. She had heard those words often, but kindness that felt almost personal. "Sir, I am just a waitress," she said softly. Vincent's expression shifted slightly. Not quite irritation, not quite sadness. No, he answered. You are a woman who continued speaking politely to people who humiliated you publicly. That tells me far more about your character than their money tells me about theirs. Several employees nearby lowered their eyes at the truth inside those words. One of the older servers near the bar quietly wiped tears from her face before turning away. Vincent pulled out the chair across from Amara and sat down for the first time that night. The movement surprised everyone in the restaurant. Powerful men like Vincent Moretti were not known for sitting beside employees. They usually spoke down to them from across polished desks, but Vincent rested his hands calmly on the table like the conversation mattered. 3 months ago, he said quietly, one of my assistant managers retired from our downtown hotel. Amara blinked in confusion. Sir, the position remains open because every candidate I interview knows how to manage luxury, Vincent continued, but very few know how to treat people with dignity once power enters the room. The manager standing near the kitchen visibly winced at the sentence. Vincent noticed but did not acknowledge it. Tonight I watched a woman humiliated in front of strangers, he continued calmly. And instead of screaming, insulting people, or throwing away her professionalism, she stayed composed. Amara lowered her gaze again. I was trying not to lose my job. Vincent nodded once. Exactly. He leaned back slightly in the chair. Desperate people often reveal who they truly are. The restaurant stayed silent enough to hear the soft jazz music playing overhead again for the first time all evening. Crystal glasses shimmered beneath golden light. Outside the front windows, downtown Chicago traffic moved through the rainy streets, completely unaware that an exhausted waitress's life had just shifted direction forever. I am not offering charity, Vincent said carefully. I do not respect charity nearly as much as earned opportunity. Amara finally picked up the business card with trembling fingers. What are you offering? She asked softly. Vincent reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and placed a folded document on the table beside the card. The Moretti Hospitality logo gleamed at the top of the page. Amara unfolded it slowly, her eyes widening line by line. Assistant Guest Relations Manager, full salary, health insurance, tuition support program. Her breath caught sharply in her throat. Sir, Vincent's voice remained steady. Your brother's tuition would be fully covered after 90 days of employment. Amara stared at the paper in complete disbelief. The room watched her silently. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody checked their phones, because for the first time all night, the restaurant was witnessing something stronger than humiliation. Restoration. Tears filled Amara's eyes before she could stop them. Why would you do this for me? She whispered. Vincent looked at her quietly for a long moment before answering. Because years ago, he said softly, someone once looked at my mother and saw only a cleaning uniform instead of a human being. His gaze drifted briefly toward the stained apron still folded beside Amara's chair. I promised myself I would never become that kind of man. By the time the last customers drifted out of Belladonna Steakhouse, the rain outside had turned the Chicago streets into rivers of gold and silver reflections beneath the city lights. The chandeliers inside the restaurant glowed softer now, their warmth settling over empty tables and abandoned wine glasses. Staff members moved quietly through the dining room, cleaning in near silence, but the atmosphere no longer felt heavy with embarrassment. It felt different, lighter somehow. Like something ugly had finally been dragged into the light and forced to leave. Amara stood near the window, wearing the replacement uniform one of the servers had brought her earlier. Her old apron, stained with frosting and humiliation, sat folded neatly inside a paper bag near the counter. She had almost thrown it away twice already, but something stopped her each time. Maybe because she knew she would never forget what tonight had felt like. Or maybe because she wanted proof that dignity could survive even the worst moments. Behind her, the remaining staff whispered softly among themselves while wiping tables and stacking menus. Some glanced toward Vincent Moretti with quiet admiration. Others looked at Amara differently now too. Not invisible anymore. Scene. The older waitress from the bar approached carefully holding a small container wrapped in foil. "The kitchen made you dinner before closing," she said gently. "You barely ate all night?" Amara blinked in surprise. They did not have to do that. The woman smiled softly. Tonight people wanted to. The simple kindness nearly brought tears back to Amara's eyes. She accepted the food carefully. Warm garlic pasta, fresh bread, something small and ordinary that somehow felt deeply important after everything that had happened. Across the restaurant, Vincent stood near the front entrance, speaking quietly with one of his bodyguards. His charcoal suit still looked perfectly composed despite the long evening, but there was a tiredness in his eyes now that had not been there earlier. Power always looked glamorous from a distance. Up close, it looked exhausting. As if sensing her gaze, Vincent turned slightly toward her. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then he walked back across the quiet dining room with the same controlled calm he had carried all night. "Your driver will take you home," he said. Amara looked startled. "Sir, you do not need to do that. Chicago at midnight is not where I prefer exhausted employees wait alone for buses." His tone stayed matter-of-fact, almost casual, but Amara noticed the manager standing nearby lower his eyes again in shame, because nobody else in leadership had ever asked how staff members got home safely after late shifts. Vincent noticed the paper bag holding the stained apron near the counter. "You kept it," he observed quietly. Amara looked down at the bag. "I think I needed to remind myself this actually happened." Vincent nodded once. "Keep it then." She looked up at him, confused. Vincent's expression softened slightly beneath the warm restaurant lights. "Not because of the humiliation," he said calmly. "Because one day your brother will graduate, your life will change, and people will assume success arrived easily. That apron will remind you how hard you fought to keep your dignity before anyone noticed." The words settled deep inside her chest. Outside, headlights swept across the rain-covered windows while the city moved endlessly forward beyond the glass. But inside Belladonna, time seemed to slow for one final moment. Amara looked around the restaurant one last time. The polished floors, the empty influencer table, the same room where strangers had laughed at her only hours earlier, now stood completely silent. Not awkward silence, respectful silence. The kind that arrives after people finally understand they witnessed something important. Vincent adjusted the cuff of his suit and stepped toward the exit. Before leaving, he paused beside Amara one final time. "You deserved better, long before I walked through those doors tonight," he said quietly. Then he disappeared into the rain-soaked Chicago night while the restaurant remained still behind him. And somewhere between the shattered pride of cruel people and the quiet dignity of a tired waitress, the world remembered what respect is supposed to look like.